Hello and welcome to our Syxsense September Patch Tuesday webinar. Today, we have our industry expert, Rob Brown, here to give us an inside look into the newest Patch Tuesday release. If you have any questions, please add them to the chat and Rob will reach out after that. And with that, Rob Brown.
Thank you, Johanna, and a very warm welcome to everyone joining us today for the September Patch Tuesday webcast. My name is Rob Brown. I'm Head of Customer Success for Syxsense, and we've been delivering this webinar for just over 2.5 years now. Around Patch Tuesday, we've been delivering managed services for our customers for well over a decade, and we've deployed over 100 million patches to date. To start with, we're going to talk about some 0 days. This is quite unique, and it's the first that I can remember of this year where we've actually had 5 0 days. There's 4 here. One actually has just been released, so I'm going to still talk about it. Extremely serious. So just before Patch Tuesday, Google did release an emergency update to fix the 4th Chrome 0-day vulnerability of the year that's actually being actively attacked since the beginning of the year. So that's based on the Chromium browser. Mozilla Firefox also was updated, 117.01 and ESR 115.2.1 and ESR 102.15.1 had the same vulnerability that is being actively exploited. And then anyone using Thunderbird for your email, that has 2 versions that are impacted, 102.15.1 and 115.2.2. The third of those trio vulnerabilities is your Microsoft Edge browser. It's all based around Chromium, similar thing. It is under active attack. Extremely serious to update those as urgently as possible. Please don't wait for a phased rollout like you might do for typical usual or strategic patch management within your environment. These do need to be tested and then deployed extremely quickly. Now, we get WinRAR very, very often, but very few of those are actually released to resolve a 0-day vulnerability. In fact, I think it's been more than 2 years. So WinRAR has released a new version to resolve an actively weaponized vulnerability that uses poison JPEG and text files that has been under active attack since April of this year. So they've taken a little while to figure this out, but this newest version does need to be deployed. Typically, WinRAR isn't available via any Windows update or WSUS patching capabilities. So I'd recommend that you download the latest version of WinRAR and deploy that. If you're using Syxsense, you'll find the WinRAR inside your patch manager. And lastly, Adobe has released a couple of updates for Adobe Reader DC and just Adobe Reader, both version 20 and 23 for both. These are under active attack, and this is probably the first 0-day vulnerability Adobe have patched this year. It's very, very important that all of these are included in any patching strategy for this month, over and above what we're about to cover under the usual patch management from Microsoft. One thing we don't usually do is talk about Apple, but we do have another 0-day vulnerability that's under active exploit. So whilst we were talking about those previous ones, I thought I'd just announce that CISA have released recommendations to address this weaponized vulnerability that could allow someone to take control of your device. For iOS and iPadOS at 15.7.9, Monterey and Big Sur are also impacted. So if you do have Apple devices in your environment, please make sure these are also updated at the same time. Now, we have an interesting Patch Tuesday, less updates than last month, significantly less critical severity than last month, but the same for that were fixed last month for important. So we had 2 critical, 55 important, 1 moderate, which was the same as last month, and 1 NA. 2 more likely to be weaponized than last month, which was interesting. 2 have been weaponized. 1 of those is public aware, and we also have 2 jump points, which is exactly the same as last month. What is interesting, though, as we get into the details of what vulnerabilities have been fixed and the severities of those vulnerabilities which have been fixed, is quite interesting. We're going to cover that in a second. Now, what type of bugs were fixed? This is actually something new. It's an interesting selection strategy for those of you that are building out a patching strategy based on severity. Traditional selection for patching is like severity, or whether it's weaponized, or whether it's public aware. But we do have these bug types, and following from like last month, when we look at the types of bugs that are fixed, it is interesting that once again, remote code execution is the highest fixed number of bugs in this release. Remote code execution is a class of cyber attack in which attackers can remotely execute commands to place malware or other malicious code on your computer or network. It's extremely important that even if the vulnerability isn't on your radar, that you do understand what vulnerabilities are solved by remote code execution. It's one of the most easiest to select inside the Syxsense console. And when we go to the Syxsense page in just a moment, I'll show you how you can find those out. Elevation of privilege, that's where a threat actor gains access to an employee's account, bypasses the proper authorization channel, and grants themselves access to data they're not supposed to have. Extremely serious as well when you're looking at these bug types, that is also selected depending on the actual impact and what software is impacted with that particular bug type. Information disclosure vulnerability, we have 9 of those. That's when a program unintentionally reveals sensitive information. Spoofing is the act of disguise. We have 5 of those. Denial of service, which is just making your device or service inaccessible. 4 of those. Security feature bypass. That's when you bypass something that you're not supposed to have access to. We had 2 of those. And defense in depth. I left this here. Last month, we had 2 defense in depth. That's that layered approach to protection and validation that Microsoft is offering via their security threat solution. It was the first time we ever saw them this year, and we haven't seen any more bug fixes this month for those. But I'm leaving those there just as a way of explaining that Microsoft have added new bug types. Now, if you're looking through the news recently, you may have been aware of the at the Las Vegas ransomware attack. Just one thing to note: if you are going to try to cover your bases, please make sure that the remote code execution vulnerability is resolved across your whole environment. And it's the best way of selecting a specific bug type to reduce your potential exploitation capability within your environment. We're also going to talk about how we prioritize patching. So traditionally, this is how we like to prioritize patches. So usually we have a big long list from Microsoft and from our third-party vendors. And we try not to use one single factor when choosing which patches are more important than others. Many customers are not able to deploy all patches at once, so they have to be selective, and we have to design the strategy from an efficiency standpoint. This is how we recommend you deploy your patches if that is the scenario. Vendor severity, that's issued by the vendor themselves. It goes from critical, which is the most serious, high or important, medium, low, and NA. NA typically is a non-security vulnerability, which is fixing something like a UI or an integration bug fix. We also have the CVSS score, which is the Common Vulnerability Scoring System. And that score is independently assigned by an authority that ranks the vulnerability from 10. And we're going to cover some of those examples today. 10 being the most serious, and as it goes down from 10 to 0 being the least serious. There isn't always a direct correlation between what the vendor will issue as a severity and what the CVSS score is. So we like to have the two together to give you a little bit more clarity around what you should be prioritizing, especially if one of the vendors tries to downgrade severity to make it look less serious. We can rely on the CVSS score to actually help us be a bit more transparent. The two states of a vulnerability is whether it's weaponized, which means it's under active attack. So Syxsense will receive information from the vendors that we support, plus our partners, our security partners, that feed into a database that we can see which of the vulnerabilities are actually being used in an active exploit. So if something is weaponized, it's actively being exploited somewhere, and that should factor in to your selection criteria, along with public aware. Now, unlike weaponization, public aware is where somebody has published the exact blueprint to expose a particular vulnerability, but it hasn't yet been weaponized yet. It just so happens that today we had something that was weaponized and public aware, but not all public aware threats become weaponized. Some of the vulnerabilities that are public aware are extremely difficult to exploit, extremely difficult. However, I wouldn't want to be an IT manager that was aware that something was documented and I didn't deploy it because it seemed very, very difficult to exploit. So again, you put these two states together and you have an idea of how urgently you should be deploying a patch to resolve that particular vulnerability. Now, to counterbalance, we have countermeasures. So this is allowing you to see if there is something you can do or something you should be aware of that requires the patch to be deployed, or whether you have a way to mitigate the vulnerability without deploying the patch. And in fact, mitigations is one of the countermeasures. So mitigations might be that you've got a next generation antivirus, or maybe you're not using that particular service or application that is impacted by this patch. Maybe you don't need to deploy that patch at all. And then you've got workarounds. So maybe some vulnerabilities can be solved by a group policy that changes a state of a service, or to change something from a security perspective, or something in the registry. And so you may be able to deploy these countermeasures or implement these countermeasures that gives you a bit more time until the patch can be deployed. And so we document all of that for you on our site as well. And you can choose to either deploy the patch or deploy the countermeasure, but it is most important that you look at the official material. If the countermeasures are recommended to be removed once you've deployed your patch, please do so. Now, if we factor this all in, what helps us to prioritize one patch over another, if all of the other factors are the same, is your exposure. So each of the CVEs that we're going to recommend and has been released by Microsoft, just put that into your tool set, see which ones of those are exposed the most, and that will give you an idea of which of those you should push first if you are not able to deploy everything all at once. So we put the exposure in to that decision, and that allows us to see very clearly, very transparently, which vulnerability I should be prioritizing first. Now, let's head over to our website where we do publish this on Patch Tuesday. So we do actually release this, and then we have the webinar the day after. If there, just while I'm bringing this across, if there are any questions, and we do love the questions, please send those over to us directly on our site. We do actually get quite a lot of questions that want to be privately answered. But if there is any questions that you'd like me to answer now, I can do so at the end of the session. So if you head across to syxsense.com, our homepage is where you will find all the details, what we do at Syxsense, from managing and securing all endpoints from our cloud solution. We have our resources page at the top, where we have links to several resources, including topics like Zero Trust, endpoint security, and of course, Patch Tuesday. And on the Patch Tuesday, you will find all of the Patch Tuesday articles that we've published. If you have any questions, please use the chat in the corner to ask, assistance. If you require a patching strategy or a patch testing strategy, even if you're not a Syxsense customer, just ask us for any of our white papers that we've designed, and we'll walk you through everything. So as we look at the list, we've got 59 fixes this month, which is not as many as last month, which includes 2 critical severities, 2 weaponized threats. As I mentioned, 55 were important, 1 moderate and 1 NA severity. And Microsoft patched pretty much everything. Very interesting. Microsoft Windows, Windows Components, Exchange, Office, .NET had almost 50% of all those fixes. So actually quite surprising. It's one of the highest number of fixes for an individual technology for .NET. Of course, there are lots of versions of .NET now. I suppose Microsoft will be at some point decommissioning the older ones. So please, until then, let's make sure that all of your versions of .NET get patched. Of course, .NET can exist in several versions on the machine at the same time. You can have .NET 2, 3.5, 4.6, for example. You can have all of those different versions installed on the same machine. They all need to be patched. Visual Studio, Azure, Microsoft Dynamics, Windows Defender, all were updated this month. Now, the 2 updates we had, which were weaponized, are also public aware. And as I've done for maybe 6 months now, I'm just trying to gauge how urgently I should emphasize the rollout of the September Patch Tuesday based on the total score of all of the CVSSs that were independently calculated yesterday. Now, we had 434.3 combined CVSS scores for all of those patches, which is 100 less than last month. However, when I've taken the average number of the CVSS score from this month and compared it to last month, which was 7.3, it actually turned out to be 7.4. So although we had a lot less vulnerabilities fixed in this Patch Tuesday, the severity on average was much higher. And so that gives you an idea that we need to probably take this Patch Tuesday more seriously than we did before. Now, to help you in addition to that, I've selected 3 vulnerabilities to talk about today, and I'm going to go into why they are my 3 top selections. I'm also going to explain the risk for those particular vulnerabilities, and then we'll take a look at the entire list further on down this page. Now, if you want, you can actually subscribe to this page to actually get an email on the day of Patch Tuesday when we publish this. So if you do want to receive these emails and then subscribe to the webinar as well, you at least have access to read some of this data. Maybe that will have questions and we can answer those for you directly. The first vulnerability we're going to talk about is CVE 2023-36761. Now, it's a very serious one, although very interesting. the vendor severity is important. Now, exploiting this vulnerability could allow disclosure of NTLM hashes within the Microsoft Office family. Now, NTLM hashes, as I've highlighted here, is actually the hashed version of your password. The password of any user account is an NTLM hash, and that's either the password to log into Windows or to authenticate or to provide security for running a service or a file. If you could disclose the NTLM hash, then potentially you could use that to trigger something on the system that you're probably not supposed to be able to do if the user has admin credentials. Very serious though, the preview pane is an attack vector. So if you are used to using Word and you look at the Word document and you have a preview pane, if something could be embedded into that document, you wouldn't even need to open it. You would just simply need to preview it in order to deliver the payload. This is the vulnerability that is both weaponized and public aware, and it is my #1 priority. It has no countermeasures, so it has to have the patch deployed. However, the reason why the CVSS is only 6.2 and not certainly much higher is because the attack vector is local. So you do need local access to the network in order to expose this. But however, if you could somehow if someone was able to get into your network, maybe they could access your system via a VPN, for example, that would be enough. And then from there, they would have local access to the devices. Attack complexity is low with no privileges. So any user can run this and potentially it could be impacted. It has no user interaction at all. Luckily, it doesn't have any jump points to speak of, which is really, really good. The next one is CVE 2023-36802. This is the Microsoft Streaming Service Proxy Elevation of Privilege vulnerability. This was also known as Office 365 Video for publishing videos. Now, this vulnerability was found by the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team. There's actually I should give kudos to others as well. There were others that assisted the Microsoft Threat Intelligence team. Please take a look at the CVE for the list of those other companies, security agencies that did in fact find this. But it's been suggested that this could be linked to an existing ransomware attack. So an attacker who successfully exploited this could run anything under system privileges, which means they can take control of your device. It has a CVSS score of 7.8 and is weaponized, and its vendor severity important. Now, it needs also local access to the device. So as long as you've got local access to the device, that is enough. Attack complexity is low, with low privileges, no user interaction, and luckily it doesn't have a jump point. So incredibly serious that you include that. Here is an Easter egg. Now, I've looked at a few recommendations by my colleagues in the security industry, and this one isn't necessarily getting picked up as a recommendation inside the top 3, but I'd like to explain what we've been doing in identifying our own internal testing. CVE 2023-38148, Internet Connection Sharing, known as ICS, Remote Code Execution Vulnerability. Now, internet connection sharing is where you can take your device and you can effectively share out the internet access that that device has to another device. So effectively acting as a router to the internet if a device doesn't have direct access. This has been suggested that it isn't enabled by default. It's not configured by default, I think, is what has been suggested amongst my security colleagues. So we were doing some testing yesterday, and we did a build of Windows 10 Pro, Windows 10 Enterprise. We're actually doing a test as Windows 11 as well. And the internet connection sharing service is enabled by default. So out of the box, this service is not running. It's not disabled though. It's in what we call a manual state. So if anything calls it, it starts up straight away. It's not disabled by default. And I think that makes it this a little bit disingenuous when it comes to whether or not you're safe from being exposed. Now, all this requires is a specially crafted packet to the service, which means you could start the service up and then deliver the payload. Microsoft is suggesting this is more likely to be weaponized. So I think that we should prioritize this one because of that fact. And it also has the highest CVSS. There are some others at 8.8, but it carries the highest CVSS for this release. The vendor severity is critical. Its risk requires an adjacent device, so you obviously have to be on the network. But it can be exploited with low attack complexity, no privileges whatsoever, no user interaction whatsoever. So I think that's incredibly serious, especially if that service is in its default manual mode. Maybe, just maybe, you might want to turn that service to disabled just until the patch can be deployed. Now, as I mentioned, we've actually taken the time to detail all of the 59 patches that were, or the 59 vulnerabilities that were fixed yesterday. So we have the reference here. So this is the CVE that you can pop into your solution. And then from the top to the bottom is the priority based on all of the 6 factors that we talked about, or also known as what we call a 6 score. Along with the weaponized status, the public aware status. The additional information helps you understand what could happen if this was exploited. And in addition, any of these vulnerabilities that are jump points, which we talk about a lot on these webinars, specifically around jump points, meaning that you could come in through to the system using one vulnerability, but then move sideways into an alternative technology. That, if you remember, is how the SolarWinds hack was so successful. They came in through one vulnerability, medium risk, low on the agenda, but through that one vulnerability, they could move sideways, and then that's where they were able to snoop around your network. So anything that has got a jump point in this list, I would highly recommend that you deploy as well, along with the impact. So this is the impact of the vulnerability. So take this list into consideration. Remote code execution are the most serious, and I really hope that both this webinar and this page will help you to create the strategy that is right for you. If you do have any questions, we'd love to answer those, work with you to solve them for you. If you would like to start a demo, or if you would like to start a trial of Syxsense, please do get in touch. And until next month, very soon we'll be looking at Halloween. So it's getting quite soon. So we will look forward to seeing you on the next one. And until next time, happy patching.